Communication is not about speaking what we think. Communication is about ensuring others hear what we mean. Simon Sinek. Think about the last time you felt that hot sting of resentment. Maybe it was today. Someone didn't help you with something you were doing around the house. Your boss didn't acknowledge the extra work you've been putting in. Or your partner didn't check on you, even though you were clearly having a rough day. You sat there, letting that anger simmer, thinking to yourself, it's common sense. They should have known. But here's where you need to be honest. Did you actually ask? Or did you just expect them to read your mind? We all do this constantly. We build these scripts in our heads of how the world should treat us, and then we get furious when people fail to follow the plan that they've never even seen. We tell ourselves we're the victim of other people's thoughtlessness because facing the alternative is too uncomfortable. We don't like admitting that people are not mind readers. And actually, no one should be held to the task of guessing what we need. When you leave your expectations unsaid, you aren't setting a standard. You're setting a trap. You're expecting someone to pass a test they don't even know they're taking, just so you can feel justified when they fail it. That bitterness that you're holding on to, it isn't proof that they don't care about you. It's proof that you're refusing to take responsibility for your own voice. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about, because at some point, we've all done it. And this episode is about the tension of how much our own suffering we actually build ourselves. Let's start with the distinction that changes everything. An expectation is not an agreement. Just because something is obvious to you doesn't mean it's obvious to someone else. Somewhere along the way, we started believing that our standards become everyone else's responsibility, simply because we've thought about them long enough. Think about how often you say things like, they should have known, or I shouldn't have to tell them. Yes, sounds reasonable. Until you stop and ask yourself, based on what? Based on a conversation that actually happened? Or based on one that only happened inside of your own head? It's where a lot of unnecessary conflict is actually born. We assume that our spouse knows what kind of support we need. We assume that our friends know what loyalty looks like to us. Or we assume that our coworkers understand what we mean by the phrase, please handle it. Additionally, if you're in a position of leadership, we can assume employees know what a successful outcome is because we've thought it through in our mind. But then we're surprised when their results don't match what we've crafted in our head. An expectation only becomes fair when it becomes shared. Until then, it's simply your private standard. That doesn't make it wrong. It just means the other person was never given the same blueprint you're using to judge the outcome. That's the part accountability forces us to own. Before we criticize someone else's execution, we have to examine our own communication. Did you actually define the objective? Did you explain what mattered? Did you make success clear enough that another reasonable person could recognize it? Because if you didn't, you're not holding someone accountable to an agreement. You're holding them accountable to your assumptions. That's a difficult reality because it shifts the responsibility back onto you. It's easier to accept people failed you than it is to admit you left them guessing. But clarity isn't a favor you do for other people. It's a standard you hold yourself to. When you make expectations unmistakably clear, you give people a fair opportunity to succeed. What's interesting, though, is that what happens next. When someone doesn't meet an expectation, the ones that we didn't clearly communicate, we rarely stop at the behavior itself. We don't simply think, oh, they just misunderstood. We almost always immediately start assigning meaning to it. We tell ourselves, they don't care. They weren't paying attention. They don't respect me enough to make the effort. Immediately, a missed action becomes a statement about someone's character. And we've all said it. If they really cared, they would have known. But knowing what someone needs and caring about them aren't the same thing. A person can care deeply and still have a completely different understanding of what you expect from them. The reverse is true as well. Have you ever disappointed someone and genuinely had no idea you did? You weren't trying to ignore them. You weren't trying to prove a point. You simply didn't know there was a standard you had failed to meet. Yet from their perspective, your mistake confirmed everything they already feared about you. It's why these situations become so personal so quickly. It stops being about what happened and starts being about the person's character. The conversation often shifts from, "This wasn't done," to, "You're inconsiderate," or from, "You missed the deadline," to, "You're unreliable." And once that happens, we stop listening to understand and start defending ourselves. But accountability requires more discipline than that. It forces us to separate facts from conclusions. They're not the same thing. And confusing them has damaged more relationships than most of us realize. Because once you turn an assumption into an accusation, you've made the conversation much harder to recover from. And once you've decided what someone's actions mean, you stop seeing them as they are and start seeing them through your disappointment. Maybe they forgot to return your call. Maybe they are late. Maybe they didn't offer to help when you hoped they would. On their own, each of those moments could have a dozen different explanations. But once resentment takes hold, you don't look for explanations anymore. You look for confirmation. Every new interaction becomes another piece of evidence that supports the story you've already accepted. That's how resentment changes your perspective, long before it changes your behavior. You still put on the smile and you still have the conversations. But internally, you've become the prosecutor. You're collecting the evidence and building a case. And now those small mistakes feel much larger because they aren't being judged on their own. They're being added to that growing case file. And the problem is that the other person usually has no idea they're even on trial. They're simply responding to today's interactions, while you're still reacting to something 20 conversations back that they never realized are connected. That's why they can often feel blindsided when that frustration finally comes out. From your perspective, it's been building over time. From theirs, it seems to have appeared out of nowhere. This is where accountability demands real self-control. And it's not that your frustration might not be valid, but your mind has started filtering reality through your emotions. Then once that happens, even genuine efforts to improve can be dismissed because they don't fit the story you've already committed to. The longer resentment sits without clarity, the more convincing it feels. But feeling convinced doesn't make your conclusions accurate. Remember, these patterns show up in many aspects of our lives. In a work environment, hearing and interpreting is a bigger issue. Think about how often someone says, "I just need you to take ownership. Use your judgment," or "handle it." Again, those phrases can sound clear because the person saying them already knows exactly what they mean to them. But relying on interpretation is where inconsistency begins. One person might believe they're expected to solve the problem, while another might think they're only supposed to get it started. Both can walk away believing that they understand the assignment, and both may be surprised when one of them is told, "Yeah, you missed the mark." That's how trust starts to erode, because we tend to lose confidence when success feels unpredictable. When the standard changes or it isn't clear, people can stop taking initiative. They begin asking permission for everything simply to avoid being wrong again. On the other hand, others can go in the opposite direction. They stop putting in extra effort because they no longer believe it will be recognized anyway. The cost of unclear expectations isn't just frustration, it's hesitation, it's disengagement. It can cause people to protect themselves instead of doing their best work. Whereas the same thing happens outside of our jobs. Relationships can become tentative instead of certain. Friends might become distant instead of direct. And little by little, trust is lost when people stop knowing where they stand. It's why clarity isn't about controlling people. It's about giving them a fair chance to succeed. Because people can rise to a clear standard. They actually struggle with the one they have to learn through trial and error. However, let's bring this back to the most important aspect, and that's personal accountability. You can't control whether people agree with your expectations. You can't control whether they have the ability to meet them. You can't control whether they choose to follow through. But you're completely responsible for whether you made those expectations clear before you judge someone for missing them. That's the standard. Far too often, we treat communication as something we assume instead of something we own. We allude or hint at it, or we think what we expect is understood, and then we move on. Then if the outcome doesn't match what we've pictured in our mind, we blame the other person for not connecting the dots. Personal accountability requires more of us than that. We have to stop measuring the quality of our communication by what we meant to say and start measuring it by what the other person actually understands. Because those are two very different standards. One of them protects our intentions. The other produces better outcomes. And additionally, there's another benefit that usually gets overlooked. When you're clear from the beginning, you also discover the truth much quicker. If someone understands exactly what's expected and still chooses not to meet the standard, you've learned something valuable. There's no confusion left to hide behind. Now you're simply dealing with a choice, not a misunderstanding. And that's much better than carrying that resentment while convincing yourself they should have known. Remember, the people around you don't expect you to communicate perfectly every time. But they do deserve honesty. They deserve clarity. And they deserve the opportunity to succeed before the experience of your disappointment. Because accountability doesn't begin when someone else fails your expectations. It begins when you decide you'll have the courage to make those expectations unmistakably clear. So, unfortunately, there will always be people who disappoint you. It's just a part of life. Sometimes they won't listen. Sometimes they won't follow through. Some will actually understand exactly what's expected and still choose a different path. And no communication can eliminate that. But don't let any of these people become the excuse for lowering your own standard. The standard isn't whether everyone responds the way you hoped. The standard is whether you consistently choose to be clear instead of assuming. Having crucial conversations over silently expecting them to read your mind. And taking ownership over your actions instead of resentment in their inactions. And most important, those are decisions no one can make for you. However, what's interesting is that the people who communicate the clearest often carry the least resentment because they remove uncertainty before it has a chance to become frustration. They don't waste energy judging people against rules that were never explained. That's a higher standard than simply being right. It's easy to convince yourself someone should have known. It's much harder to ask whether you made it possible for them to know. Getting that clarification requires humility because the answer may not be what your emotions want to hear. So don't forget, the quality of your relationships, your leadership, and even your own peace of mind won't be determined by how accurately people guess what's inside your head. It'll be determined by how willing you are to make what matters known to them. The strongest people aren't the ones who expect others to figure them out. They're the ones who leave so little room for misunderstanding that accountability becomes fair, trust becomes stronger, and resentment has fewer places to hide. As always, thanks for spending a few minutes with me. Until next time, stay sharp, stay grounded, and keep showing up.